Hey, we're live.
Hello, everybody. It's my distinct pleasure to be here in this hangout with Zara Altair, who has been a friend for a while online, and I've gotten to know Zara through. Well, before we get into all that, let's say hello to Zara first. Hi, Zara.
Hi, Oleg. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
It's great to have you here. Um, so, like I said, we became friends online, and I found out that Zara is doing writing for businesses. So, if anybody needs any writing done for their website, for their blog, she's the woman that does that for all kinds of different businesses. And then over time, it turned out that Zara doesn't just write business content; she also writes books. And so, she sent me was kind enough to send me a copy of one of her short stories, and at first, I kind of was taken aback with all these uh, names that are hard to pronounce and hard to keep track of, things like that. But then, fairly quickly, I kind of got adjusted to that. And now, uh, Zara got a new book out called, let me bring up a picture of this book. Um, the book is called The Roman Heir, and you can see it available right now on Amazon and a bunch of other good book providers. And this is a book that I finished reading last week. And before we get into my end of the book, in terms of me talking about what I think of the book, uh, let's talk to Zara and get some background first. So, Zara, let's start with just the very, very beginning. So, um, how did you get into the whole book writing genre and concept? Because, like I said, I do know you write content for websites, for blogs. How did you get into book writing in the first
Oh,
place?
I've been writing since I was a kid. I've been writing stories, and then for years I wrote poetry and was published and gave numerous readings. And I was involved in California Poets in the Schools, where we taught poetry to kids, which is really fun. You drop in out of the sky and immediately throw away all the grammar rules, and the teachers are going, we're just learning semicolons this week. And I said, that's fine, we'll do that later. It's called editing, it's a separate process. And that was really fun. It was really fun. Working with kids is fun. I ended up teaching at university level, teaching teachers to teach writing and poetry, and that was kind of fun too, because um, I was like totally jazzed. I was like, oh my gosh, all these teachers want to learn about writing, and so the first meeting in class, when I went around the room and said, why are you here? And they all are like, I'm here to get units. And I'm like, oh boy, and and so they were all very skeptical, and they were like, well, how do you know when it's working? And I said, well, it's the light in their eyes, and they're still like,
Mhm.
and so actually I did with the adults exactly what I do with the kids, and they started writing, and then all of a sudden someone would get it, and pretty soon they were all going, oh, she's got the light in her eyes. And because it's such a non-linear process. It's a process, and it's really, connecting your internal feelings and your perceptions and turning it into words and syntax. And so once you sort of free yourself of preordained, this is how you write stuff, I think it's actually easier to teach children because they don't have any preordained concepts.
Mhm.
But that things start flowing and people write really beautiful things.
Yeah.
So
So
anyway,
actually,
that's how I got started. Then how I got started with this series, which is set in Italy in the early 6th century, was really a conversation with my daughter, and we're both fans of Italy and being in Italy, and she's actually there right now, as a matter of fact. And we were singing praises of Venice, and she said, you know, Mommy, you should go to Ravenna. You would really like Ravenna. And then she started on this long history of Ravenna, and she said, and all of a sudden she was saying, you know, and he led his people across the frozen Danube, and they went down into Italy, and how da da. And I went, wow, I wonder what it was like to live then. And that was sort of the beginning of the process. And wow, learned so much.
All right. So basically, it sounds to me that you actually went the other way. In other words, you were already writing those kind of books and poetry before you even got into the whole business thing. So I got it backwards.
Exactly,
I get it.
exactly.
Okay. So you're already a veteran then. Okay. So you got the idea from your daughter, and one of the things that fascinated me about the whole, starting with your prior book, uh, is the way you're immersing the reader, in that case was me, into that environment where you begin to feel, in other words, the book itself is a murder mystery, which, I've read tons of these kind of books. And of course, for the most part, they're in modern times, not the ancient times.
Right.
And of course, you read the old Games of Thrones and all those books too, which happened way back in fictional land, so to speak. But here, the thing that amazed me and fascinated me was that you're immersing me into this environment. And for those who don't know me, originally I came from Soviet Union, but we actually immigrated through Italy, and it was just kind of astonishing because I was reading the Roman Heir, and Zara is writing as things are happening at this town called Ostia, which is exactly where we lived for 4 months when we were immigrating to the United States. So it was pretty incredible to me to read something about, it's a dinky little town. It's not anything, major on the map or anything. It's about 20-minute ride from Rome by their train over there. I mean, it's very close to Rome, but not exactly in the vicinity of Rome. And so it was interesting for me to read because I've been there to that very place, obviously not in the 6th century. But one of the things I found fascinating about Zara's writing is how she's kind of placing you in the place, and then you're able to almost like you're walking with these people. I mean, this is one of the things that I think a lot of authors miss because they just tell, well, he said this, and then she came and she said that, and he said that, and so you get nothing but this dialogue, almost like a little screenplay being played. And the English is not always so hot. Sometimes the stories are decent, sometimes they're not even that. But this was an example here where the story is actually taking you inside, and you get to walk among these people, and you can see what they're like, you can see what their feelings are like, you can see what their psychology was at the time. Like one of the things that Zara was had in this book is this very touchy political situation between people, because here's this woman, I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but a woman whose husband was killed, and in a minute we'll talk about the main hero here. She's talking to him, he's trying to resolve the murder, and yet she's saying you have to be kind of careful how you tread because of other people and how it impacts her standing in the city. And if you look at it from that perspective, it's to me it's fascinating to see how on one hand she's torn between trying to pull the reins back so he doesn't really push it as hard as he can, because some people may look at this woman in a different light, politically speaking, how things are going in that little town and how these people are. And so there's a lot of stuff going on saying, yeah, well, if you're in Rome, you behave differently, but if you're here, you behave this way. So Zara, how did you come, how did you get into this whole 6th century Roman thing and were able to do such a beautiful job kind of immersing the reader into that environment?
Well, I've done years of research, so that's part of it. It's like knowing your place. And yeah, another thing that I do and have been doing for a number of years is helping people with story, both screenwriters and narrative fiction writers. And one of the things that can happen very easily in a screenplay is what I call characters floating in space. You have, as you're reading the screenplay, you have no idea where they are. Or even if they're in a character's room, you don't know if it's neat and tidy or if it's messy or if there are windows that are spreading light around or any of those things. So, and that in a story, you need to travel with the characters, and that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, going on a grand journey, but you need to walk across a room with them, and you need you need to know where the furniture is. You may not mention it all in the story, but in your head as a writer, you need to know all those things, so that your char- characters are staged, as it were. You know,
Yeah,
Hitchcock,
it's kind of like the
the
artist
filmmaker, was
painting.
great at staging people in his films, and it's the same process. It's like, where is everybody? Are people having a conversation where they're face to face, or are they across the room or across the table, and who's standing and who's sitting? And those are the details that bring you into the story. And it doesn't matter where your story takes place, those are the details that bring you into the story. So the cultural details kind of filter through from how people perceive each other or how they interact or where they walk, and who addresses whom, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like, to me, it's kind of like a painter. You know, painter can paint a picture, and they're obviously showing you everything they want you to see, so you see it and you get it. Movies are even better to some degree because they're able to actually have movement going on. In addition, painter can have the movement going on very easily, but movies obviously can't. So they actually can paint, if you will, the entire picture for you. You don't have to figure it out. But the cool thing here is the good authors, and like in this particular book that I keep saying that I found it fascinating, is that there is so much of this painting going on in my head using words that I'm able to actually get into this immersion of being in the Roman times, in the Roman Empire, in the middle of the 6th century. So that I thought it was just awesome how Zara did that. So let's speaking of that, let's move on to the character. So the main character, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you before we get into that, is the names of these characters. Where did you come up with these names? Did you just pick them out of thin air, or how did you come up with that?
Well, actually, as I was doing my research, one of the main sources of information for that period is the letters which this fellow preserved, of a man named Cassiodorus. Um, and they tell us a lot. They're all letters either from himself or from the king, um, to various individuals within, I can't talk, within the kingdom of Theodoric, which is the time period we're talking about. So, you know, a barbarian was actually ruling Italy at this time. And I was reading, and there was this sort of admonishing letter to this fellow in Rome called Argolicus. And then as I went through, there were 9 other mentions of him in the letters.
Okay, so it's Argolikos, because I was reading it like Argolikos. It's Argolikos is the
Yeah,
proper way.
and well, actually, even today in Italy, it depends on whether you're from the north or the south, how you pronounce it. But at that time, people were speaking Latin for the most part, although Latin was turning into Italian in Italy at that time. So there was, you know, the local vernacular, as it were, was going toward what we think of as Italian today. Anyway, yes, so he came up and I went, and so there were various incidents in these letters, and they are sprinkled throughout the stories, but most of his character, his demeanor, the way he perceives things, all of those things are from my imagination, because we don't know anything about him really other than that he existed.
Right, and he used to be per book, for your book, he used to be some kind of magistrate, right? Um, uh, like inspector general type guy, or what was he?
Yes, exactly. That's what he was in Rome. He was part of the Senate, and he was what we would call a magistrate. Yes, so he arbitrated. He essentially arbitrated and made decisions about things that were going on in Rome.
Yeah, and so interesting thing.
A judge, as it were.
Right, he's here on a
But
personal trip.
Not a judge like we think of a judge in the United States, but more like actually a magistrate in Italy right now, where they initiate investigations and.
Yeah, but in this particular book, it's interesting because he's actually not in his official capacity. He's not doing that anymore. He's just, you know, taking this trip, and I won't spoil why he's taking what he's doing, but he's not in his official capacity as a magistrate.
No, actually, in all of these stories, there are more to come. And all of these stories, he has left this official capacity,
right?
But he has a reputation for fairness and, I don't know, I guess what we would call wisdom, that he weighs things and thinks about things. And
it's interesting that his friend, and he happens to be his tutor also in terms of fighting skills and some other stuff, happens to be, it's almost like his servant and at the same time his companion, and at the same time his tutor, is this Nicholas. Is that how you pronounce? How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, Nicholas. Yeah, and he is Greek, and he is actually it's an old tradition of Roman patricians that children had a tutor, and that tutor was purchased as a slave when a child was about 5 and was responsible for their education. But because they are slaves, many of them, like in this situation, were with their master, as it were, until death, or if they are freed. So
it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. It's I know in my writers group, one of the comments that one of my fellow writers said, was commenting about how slaves are just taken for granted in the story, and they are. I mean, slaves were just part of life. It wasn't there wasn't a judgment attached to it at all. So, and this guy's fairly wealthy. He's wealthy. But yes, they have developed a friendship where this tutor has been with him and has taught him things, and also is a little more realistic about life than this thinker is. Nicholas notices things that
so
kind of go by Argolicus, and
it's worked really well, I think, between the two of them, and how much help he gives them. And also, there is a concept of homeschooling. That's where homeschooling must have started.
It is homeschooling, exactly.
So
without computers or anything.
And then the gentleman that he's helping, from the family, one of the sons of the guy who died, who was killed, he didn't die. His name is it pronounced as Philo or Philo?
You know what? I just double looked that up earlier, and in Latin it can be either way.
Okay, so Philo. So he also is an interesting character. I mean, there's all the characters in this book are definitely interesting. You get to know him to a degree that you need to get to know him, but at the same time, it's interesting how he flows through it. One of the things Zara did, which it's not really a spoiler, but I'll tell you, you really need to read the book all the way to the end. It's a fairly short book. It's only like around 90 pages, but you need to read it to the end to find out what the deal is. It's kind of in a lot of other books you read about murder mysteries. You get the author kind of drives the logic to the point where usually, if you're fairly interested in the concept and everything, you kind of know where it leads, and you kind of know who might be, and very rarely there is a surprise at the end that, oh my God, it's a totally different person who killed him than I thought it was. So usually they kind of drive you to the point of you find out the killer. Sometimes you even find out before the end of the book. In Zara's case, you don't get to find out until the very end of the book, and it's not anybody I would have thought at all. I mean, even though I've seen tons of movies and read a lot of books on the genre, I had no idea it was going to be something like this. So it's really well manufactured in terms of the actual outcome. And another thing that's interesting I wanted to ask you about is that um, the in a lot of these books, murder is the main thing. Like everything revolves around trying to figure out who killed who, and it's all about the murder and this and that. In your book, it's the murder is like the least important thing of this entire book. I mean that everything else that goes on in this book is far more important than the murder is, even though this is a murder mystery. How did you come about that kind of approach?
Well, part of it is that at that time, murder was not a crime. So, and in the story, the Roman Heir, the family's got to figure out a way to find out who did it because it's not a crime. The only time that murder was a crime in Roman law at this time was if it somehow affected the public good. So if it was a senator or somebody important, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But just because you were rich didn't mean you were important in that public way. And so that's one of the dilemmas this family faces. So, and at this time in Italy, there were two rules of law. One was the Italian, the Roman law, which had which preceded the Ostrogoth rule, and which the king said, okay, we're just let all the Italians live with their old rule, and we're not going to make anything complicated. However, all of the Ostrogoths who were now in Italy, they had their own set of rules, and even under their law, murder wasn't a crime the way we think of it as a crime. It was a bad thing that you did, and you owed the family of the murdered person something. It could have been money, it could have been cattle, it could have been anything, and that was determined by their legal advisors at this point in time, called the Seyo. Um, so in either culture at this time, murder was kind of a personal thing. So it didn't have what we think of in American society as, okay, the police are going to come and all this stuff is going to happen and then it's going to go to court and blah blah blah. This is all it's a personal family matter, as it were. It's the simplest way of putting it. And it is the impetus for each of the stories, the murder that is involved. But it's also the main character has to figure out, the family has to figure out what the situation is. He has to figure out, who, as much as he can, about the person who has died. And he has to navigate the politics of the time, which don't particularly have to do with murder, but they certainly have to do with power plays. So that's kind of how that happened.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I mean, that part was really interesting because they kept bringing up about the murder, and the guy keeps saying, "Yeah, but this is not a public matter. This is a family matter." And so this is what Zara was just talking about, the fact that they did have this, the murder situation did not wasn't at all like it's looked at these days, and they did have it set up in such a way where if it wasn't anybody important, and when you say anybody is important, this particular guy who was killed in this book was the kind of main deal maker and business guy in Ostia. But
Yes, but
but
Ostia
he
was just as tiny as it is
right,
now.
exactly, right. And but he was basically, so he was a nobody in Rome, but he was, everybody basically the main person in Ostia. There was this big disconnect, and that's why they looked at this as nobody in Rome cared about this guy being murdered, but the family certainly cared because they looked at it as it was their family member, and he was important in that city, and it was a private matter, family matter.
Right.
But the family asked um, this magistrate, ex-magistrate guy that came to town on just a short visit. He was there for like a week to see if he can help them figure out who was responsible for the murder. And so it's interesting to go through, like Zara said, to go through all the thinking. The Nicholas is helping him, but he's trying to figure out on his own, who was involved and what enemies did the guy have. Why would anybody have any kind of interest in potentially killing him? And then, fairly quickly he figures out that, he had a lot of dealings being the main guy in town business-wise with different people, and he kind of kept a lot of people under their thumb, because of that. And at the same time also did some things that he kept secret that nobody even knew. I mean, some of the things there reveals even the family didn't know that he was involved in some of the things he was doing for the sake of keeping the power and keeping the wealth and things like that. So it's kind of a fascinating look through all of these different things that are going on. And this gentleman only has, like I said, a week of time, and then he has to go back to Rome, and he has to try to figure this out. And he's almost giving up throughout towards the end there. And he was going to give it to the local magistrate to come back because he was out apparently on the trip, and perhaps he would help him because he was just not getting anywhere after there's only so much you can do in a few days. And so it's really interesting to read how this whole thing evolves, and in the end, of course, you do find out who killed him and why he was killed, and we're not going to talk about that, but you do get to find out if you read the book. So the book again is called The Roman Heir. Before we continue here, let's jump back to the Amazon page here. This is what it looks like. And
Whoops, that's the look inside
this
thing.
is the look inside thing. Yeah, so let's show back that again. And you can get it from Amazon. Just look for the name you see right there, Argolicus Mystery, and you will see some other books that Zara has published, short stories about him as well. And you
I
can
should
get
also
your own
mention,
name.
Oleg, just if there are people who have
Sure.
favorite reading devices, that it's available just about for any e-reader that you have. So Nook and iBooks and all of those, as well as Amazon.
Right, and also another thing I wanted to mention that right now, because it's a brand new book, Zara was gracious enough and kind enough to let people buy it for practically nothing. Considering how good this book is, it's amazing that you letting people buy it right now for only 99 cents. But I just wanted to make this point that on Kindle you can get it now at 99 cents. This price is going to go away very soon, and if you're listening here or you're watching this, if you don't get it quickly, you're not going to get this price. But right now, you can actually get it at 99 cents. So just awesome price and for a great book here. Okay, so let's go back to the story again.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's also was interesting is that like I said, let's talk a little bit more about the politics of the deal. That the way the interaction was between the wife and as this guy, her husband, gets killed. she winds up in a very precarious position where she wants to maintain a certain level of power that he wielded before and certain standing in town, because otherwise she would not have any kind of means. Well, I guess they were pretty rich anyway, but apparently that was super important to her. I mean, what can you add about that, Zara? About how she said
Well,
that,
she, she's,
Amelia, right, was her name?
yeah, she's Amelia. Yes, she's a Roman matron, and she's enjoying her position in this little town because her husband is the big
He
dude.
ruled it. Yeah, he
Yeah,
ruled the
he's
town.
the big fish in the small pond, and she's Mrs. Big Fish. And so a murder in the family is kind of this besmirching the family name. And so Agulikas is going out and he's, asking people and he's asking questions, and the rumors come back to her right away, this small town,
Right.
and she's like, hey, just don't make so many waves. You're upsetting people. Just stop making these waves. And without giving anything away, Argoligas finally asks her, he says, well, what do you care more about, your position or
Right.
finding your husband's murderer? And she has to make a decision about that. But yes, so she's very, and their marriage is a marriage of arrangement, and they have, kept it going all these years. It isn't a marriage based on love. It's a contractual agreement, and they've worked out their way of being together and how they raise their family. So, yes, she's very worried. She just like lost her big thing.
So what? So obviously, men ruled the world, and I mean, in those days especially. So what would happen to her? I mean, what exactly would happen if the guy is going away? They did have the money, so what is she worried about? I mean, that's the part I didn't quite understand. I mean, what would happen to her and her standing in town if he pressed the wrong buttons? I mean, she'd still have her wealth, right?
People would be resentful. Her husband wouldn't be there to do all the manipulating that he used to do to keep in power. And she would pretty much be on her own. And she isn't particularly a manipulator the way her husband was.
And so, in terms of the wealth of the family, you're saying she would lose the wealth because the kids would
She
get it?
wouldn't lose her. She wouldn't lose her wealth, but she would lose her position. She would, She would. She wouldn't have that personal political power, as it were, as the matron of the the town.
Mm-hmm.
She would lose that. And they do have a house in Rome. And if she went back to Rome, her concern is, if the business is going, but there's no reason for her to be particularly in Ostia anymore. If she went back to Rome, she'd be just another Roman patrician's wife and a widow at that.
Right, right. And of course, we get to find out in the book about some of the less than moral things people did in those days. It's not anything
They
new.
still do them.
Romans were not moral, just like everybody else and stuff. But it's also part of the book. And like I said, at the end, you do. The biggest thing is not finding out who killed this guy, the family head, but actually the biggest thing, at least to me, that was rewarding is just, like I said, getting into this environment of this ancient Rome and walking these streets and seeing these people and seeing how they think and how they interact and how they react. And it's just a fascinating look at this thing that I haven't really seen. Well, like I said, to me, it was fascinating to read about this kind of environment and situation and everything else. So definitely worthwhile read, The Roman Heir by Zara. And Zara, tell us a little bit more about you wrote some short stories before, which are available also. But what is your plan? Is this going to be like an ongoing concern for a long time with, all kinds of different books
I
coming
have
out?
12 of these stories planned, these short stories. And so this is the fourth.
Right. So okay. So tell us about well, why 12? It just that's what you came up with. It's okay. But why short stories? Why
I
short
don't know.
stories?
They were the first one. The first one was the used virgin, and it was just a fun exercise for me. I was reading those letters by Cassiodorus, and in one of the letters, there's this really weird thing that happens, and this fellow Adeodatus is accused of raping a virgin, but the punishment is very bizarre. The punishment is, okay, you are exiled for 6 months, so get out of Italy, and then when you come back, if anybody mentions it, they're going to get the same punishment you get. And scholars are like, what? And I went, well, who better to solve this mystery than, our hero? And so I wrote that little story. It's very short, and then it sat on my computer for like 4 years. And this is how I got started publishing. And I, one day I went, oh, this is silly. Nobody knows this story exists, and it's just sitting there. It's doing nothing on my computer. What if I just put it up on Amazon? And I'm sure, as Ben can tell you, his new experience with putting a book up on Amazon, there's a whole new learning curve about being a self-published author. That's a whole different story. But so that's how this all got started. And I was already working on the Peach Widow. So things just sort of started happening, and then I got a more formalized plan in my head, and then not on paper, but you'll be happy to hear that, Oleg, not on paper, but in Google Drive, a plan of all the stories and how they go. I'm also just starting with really beginning stages of a novel-length novel with the same characters, and much more complicated with subplots and all of that business that happens. And
I see. So you're going to have a
more room to explore and bring more people in, and have sub stories that go along and move the main story forward, and they intertwine and all that business. And that is, I don't know, my process is very free-form brainstorming at the beginning. So I maybe have a piece here and a piece over there, and then something over here, and a bit of dialogue that somebody says, and I just put them I just throw them all in a Google Doc. And as the ideas kind of start formulating in my head about how the story's going to progress, then I can take those sort of free-form brainstorm ideas and organize them more into a very loose outline. I have a very loose outline when I write, because one of the things I've discovered is that when I'm writing, characters do and say things that I never would have planned, and they may tweak the story in some way. As a matter of fact, in the Roman Heir, originally there was a different murderer. So so it's very loose. So it's nothing really happens till you write the story. I was just looking at an interview with the thriller writer Joe Nesbo, I don't know, maybe a week ago or something, and he essentially said the same thing. It's like you can have this general overriding idea of what the story is, but nothing really happens till you get in there and start writing, and the characters start doing things and speaking to each other, and a particular phrase or a particular action can move the story in a way that if you'd sat and plotted out every
Yeah, it wouldn't be the
detail,
same. Sure.
it wouldn't be there. Yeah.
Let me ask you this: when you do your stories, do you usually know how it's going to end before you write the story, or is it kind of evolving over time?
I'm sorry, your voice is kind of, say that over again.
When you do your stories, do you plan it ahead of time in terms of how it's going to end, so you know exactly what you're leading up to, or is it something that you just let happen serendipitously, or
It's
just whatever
it's
happens
just the
happens?
process I explained. So there's a general, I hesitate using the plan. There's a general overview. Yes, I do have an end in mind. In this particular case, the ending shifted a little because it turned out that it was that somebody else was the murderer than who I thought it was at the beginning.
Small but important detail.
Yeah, yeah, but
Yeah.
there is an overall plan. It's just, plan sounds much more high schooly than it
No,
is.
it's yeah, the reason I'm asking is because I was listening to another author I really enjoy and like, and he said absolutely, said he never writes any books without having the end story there, first in his head, and then he writes, so he knows ahead of time
Yeah,
how things
because
are
you're,
gonna.
especially in a mystery, you're heading toward the end. You're heading toward the mystery being solved.
Right.
It really does help to know what the end is. And part of that is, I've heard and read different views about this. Part of that is, in a mystery, you have to plant the clues but hide them inside the story.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't know what the end is, it's really hard to plant clues for your protagonist and for the reader if you don't know who did it, you know. And
Yeah.
so mysteries are a little bit different than thrillers. Um, Mysteries are a puzzle, and the reader and the protagonist, the detective or the PI or whoever it is solving a puzzle. And so you're trying to find out who the killer is. In thrillers, you often know who the killer is, but now you're trying to either get away from that killer, depending on what kind of thriller it is, get away from that killer, or capture them, overcome them. So, like, Robert Ludlum books,
Right.
they always go in the same
Mm-hmm.
path. It was just, he, in my opinion, is the ultimate action writer, just brilliant action stories. So, yeah. So
I
knowing
was
the
listening.
end
I actually
is
went.
very helpful.
Yeah, I went to a meeting with Greg Horowitz, which is one of the authors I really like, and he said, interestingly, my son asked him, about the same topic. He was asking him, what do you do if you have like a writer's block? And the guy goes, he says, you still write. He says, he says, I usually do, first thing I do is what I call vomit draft. And he says it's going to be horrible. I know that, but I write it anyway. And then I just come back to it, to edit it, and then it becomes something more decent. So I think probably a lot of authors do that kind of stuff, and it's kind of similar to what you said. One of the things that I wanted to ask you was about the um, unexpected things and things action changing all the time. Because in your books, from so far at least I've read, there's definitely things going on, but everything is a very slow paced. In other words, you're not rushing anybody. You're not turning into oh my god, what's going to happen on the next page, like some other mysteries you read do. In your case, it's a very kind of very nice, soft, pleasant ride from beginning to the end. Is that intentional, or is it just the way you write?
No, it's some of each. It's intentional, and it is the way I write. And the people in a story, I really believe the characters in a story are what readers want to engage with. You know, a plot is a plot, and unless you're a very skilled action writer like Robert Ludlum, and I'm not, you know, for me to attempt that kind of story, which is a thriller rather than a mystery, for me to attempt that kind of story, that would just be a total fail. You know, I'm not there. It's not my kind of story. I like reading them. It's not part of my skill set to write them, but I do like writing these stories because there's so much humanity in people, and there's so much. I like exploring the characters. In this particular story, my favorite character was the son, actually, Philo, because he's so conflicted. And you know, his father has died, and he's left in this position of power with absolutely no skills to manage what he needs to manage. He's kind of a bookish nerd kind of kid, you know, and all of a sudden he's thrust into this position of politics and business, and trying to navigate all these uh, people who are much more sophisticated than he is.
Yeah, no, and he still comes across as a pretty smart. He's a young guy, obviously, and
He's smart. He's just not worldwide.
Not experienced yet, right?
Yeah.
Right. No, it's believe me, it's kudos to you in terms of it's not any kind of lack of writing in terms of action or anything. It's just it would be totally unnatural to me if in that time frame people moved at a faster pace than they are. I mean, you're kind of, like I said, that's part of the whole immersion thing into that time frame, is that things move in a natural way how they used to move in that time frame, based on technology that was there.
Based on car chases.
Exactly. There's no cell phones. There's no, you know, none of that. None of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, people went around on foot. You know,
Exactly.
They walked everywhere, and so the pace is very different than the way we live now. And you know, even with post horses and riding at full gallop, it took 2 days to get from Rome to Ravenna. So we had the old capital and the new capital, and so news traveled more slowly, letters traveled more slowly, everything traveled more slowly. And you know, one of the initial action of the book of the story is that Argalik is asked to deliver a book to this young scholarly kid, you know.
Right.
And he's asked to do that because it's personal transportation, and he's going rather than entrusting this. Books were a big deal, you know, rather than entrusting this book to some kind of transportation system, or even sending a slave to deliver it, you know, back again. Here's somebody who's already going there, and hey, could you, and who respects books too. So they understand the quality of the gift.
Zara, do you have, yeah, and my personal feeling is I think that you have this major reverence, obviously being a writer, for books and for writing, and so you revere this very much, and I think you infuse that respect for books in your stories as well. I mean, this is where you're making a big deal about that him taking the book and how much books meant. Am I reading it incorrectly in terms of?
No. Actually, it's one of the things about Argalikas too, is he reads books, and you know, one of his at-home activities is, you know, reading with his tutor. They read out loud. They read aloud, and that's part of his daily activities. He's you know, a closet reader, or whatever you want to call it. And one of the things he looks forward to about going going home to the provinces is, he's get to spend his time in his study reading stuff, and
Sure.
he has this vision of what's going to happen when he gets home. He's 32. Maybe he'll look for a new wife. He was married before, but his wife died in childbirth. But his whole goal is to get out of the politics of Rome and to just go home and relax and read books. That's his vision of how cool life is
Happiness.
going to be.
Illusion of happiness. Yeah. Sarah, do you put any of yourself at all in any of the characters in your books?
Not me per se. Argalika's personality is very much based on my son. As a matter of fact, in that same writing group, I was reading, and one of the people in the group knows my son, and she said, "Ah, I can hear him saying that." She said, "I know exactly where you got that conversation." But my son is very stoic. He doesn't speak much unless he has something to say. And and my genes are in him, so that's as close as you get to maybe part of it.
Okay. Another question I had was, do you plan in your future books to have some of the other characters appear as well? In other words, like maybe Philo or Philo, or you want to pronounce it, or any of the other characters that they would somehow get back into the story again, or that's not the plan?
I don't know. You never know. I do have a list of every character in every book, a master list of characters, so that they can appear again. I know in the Peach Widow, there was a same writing group, Hue and Cry, and the Peach Widow, the dog Pup. Originally, this is how stories get changed. He was going to die, and they were all like, "Save Pup, save Pup." And I went, "Oh gosh." So now, from that period of time forward in any of the stories, Pup has to appear. So, and the Nantius, the governor who's in the Used Virgin, he's the dude. He's the corrupt governor of the region, and he's in the background of all the stories that are set in southern Italy, because he's the power behind everything that happens, for good or bad. And and then Argalika's mom is there with him at their villa in the country, and the overseer, what we would call in modern parlance, the farm manager, is there. He's always, he's in charge of everything that happens as far as agriculture is concerned on the farm, on the villa. And so, yes, there are characters who show up more or less in different stories. I don't know if any of these people are going to show up again, because he's leaving Ostia and he won't be back as far as I know.
Well, you're the only one who does know, so
Yeah, so I mean, but I don't see that happening in any of the future books. Yeah.
Do you plan to write any other books, for other characters, solely other topics or anything, or you're pretty much going to stick to these stories?
Well, I like working with these characters. I have a different set of books in mind. I haven't quite formulated how I want to do them. I have the main character. He's retired law enforcement officer, and then I have one of his sidekicks who's a woman, who's a PI in the way that most PIs work now, and with she has computer skills.
Hmm.
And that's just kind of cooking in the background for now.
Gotcha. But for those that don't know, Zara plans to live till she's 300. Just so all these books can be written and created. One final question, and we'll wrap it up. So, one question I had was, when is the next book coming out, and what is it going to be called?
I can't tell you the answer to the first question yet, but probably in 4 or 5 months.
Okay.
And the book is called The Vellum Scribe.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, Vellum Scribe, the first few pages of it are actually part of the Roman Heir, so you can actually read a little bit in there. Go ahead, Zara.
Yeah, all right. Argalika's uncle comes to visit, and old wounds kind of pop up about who is a true Roman citizen and not. So it's a different story.
Excellent, excellent. So anyway, just again, thank you immensely for taking the time today. And definitely, I would encourage anybody to look into Zara's books on Amazon and other booksellers. And you can go to her site, which is zaraaltair.com, just her name.com. You can find her on Google Plus. She's easily found. And Zara, thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleg. This was a really enjoyable conversation. I really had fun.
Thank you very much. And
Thank
looking forward
you, everyone.
to reading the next book. And good luck to you. And take care.
All right, thank you.
Bye bye.